That's right. We're very fortunate to have Leith Van Onselen from macrobusiness.com.au and the chief economist at the MB Fund and MB Super. He joins us every week for his Treasury of Common Sense. Leith's on the line. Hello, mate.
G'day, Trent. How's things?
Really well. You know what? I was going to say really well, but then I listened to Chris Bowen a minute ago and it's just brought the whole tone down, Leith. So let's try and bring the tone back up. The Overton window is open on immigration, and this has been particularly interesting this week.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So obviously the rise of One Nation, it's finally caused the Albanese Labor government to seemingly pivot on immigration. It looks like they're about to pivot on immigration because this week the ABC reported that Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke has basically abruptly postponed a National Press Club speech in which he was expected to announce significant cuts to Australia's migration intake. And basically, Labor seems to be panicking a little bit on the whole immigration policy because obviously One Nation's going very hard on it. They've risen very strongly in the polls. And obviously the coalition also wants to lower immigration as well. I mean, obviously not as aggressively as One Nation, and it sort of left Labor standing out there on their own, doing worse and worse in the polls and being, particularly stranded on immigration. And it comes on the back of Australia experiencing, obviously, a record migration boom post-pandemic. And since Labor came to office in mid-2022, 1.4 million net overseas migrants have landed every day every day they've been in office, based on the data that we have.
Yep.
And that's basically 1,100 net migrants have landed every day that the Albanese government's been in office, which is obviously an extraordinary number, and we're seeing a rental crisis and all the problems that go with it. So Tony Burke was scheduled to front the National Press Club, and apparently he was going to unveil a whole bunch of so-called tough reforms aimed at lowering immigration, so including tougher family visas, caps on backpacker numbers, restrictions on asylum seekers, their ability to appeal, and their ability to work while we're here, crackdowns on working holiday maker visas, all this sort of stuff. And one source who was close to the ABC said that the government was aiming for a quote-unquote quick and drastic cut to net migration. Now, apparently one of the reasons why the speech got pulled from the National Press Club is because Acting Prime Minister Richard Marles, he reportedly vetoed Burke's package on the basis that it wasn't comprehensive enough and it left the immigration system still ripe for rorting. So that sort of suggests that maybe they wanted even a tougher package, or some members in Labor actually want a tougher package. Now, my view here, Trent, is that Labor should simply get on the phone and call the Canadian government, which is also a left-leaning government.
Yep.
So they're called the Liberal government over there, but they're basically Canada's Labor because they've just been through this whole process. So Canada's Liberal government, the left-leaning government over there, they were the incumbent government, or they are the incumbent government, I should say, and they were facing a similar political backlash because they massively ramped up immigration post-COVID and they experienced all that record migration, record population growth. They had a rental crisis that they'd never seen before, all the problems that come around from growing your population too fast. And they were facing electoral annihilation in early 2025. So what they did, the election was in early 2025, but they were facing electoral annihilation. So what they did was in late 2024, they responded by announcing deep cuts to Canada's migrant intake. So they effectively have aimed to pause population growth in Canada over many years, and they effectively tightened up the temporary migrant system immensely. They've also cut the permanent migrant intake by 25%. And because of these policies, Canada has actually experienced falling population and a big outflow of temporary migrants. So Canada's population has actually declined by 235,000 since these reforms came in. That's about 0.6% of its population. The stock of temporary migrants in the country has fallen by nearly 600,000. And because of this, Canada's rental crisis has effectively been solved because Canada's rents have fallen for 21 consecutive months after experiencing a massive boom. And that means that's meant that Canadian rents are down by about 8% from the peak. And the typical Canadian renter is now saving $2,000 a year. Now, Canada's economy has also actually performed better than expected in per capita terms. So while the growth there has been pretty weak, because the population's falling, their per capita growth is actually better than what it was previously. So these reforms have actually been quite successful in Canada. And as a result, the Canadian government is doing really well in the polls, and Canadians are very happy with this situation. So what I'd like to see Anthony Albanese and Tony Burke do is get on the phone to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Immigration Minister Lena Diab and seek advice on how to cut immigration. Because if the Canadian left-leaning government, which ran the biggest migration program in Canada's history and was also, very pro-immigration and open borders, if they can pivot because they saw the writing on the wall and they saw it was actually harming Canadians, and they can do the complete opposite and actually run a significantly lower immigration program, and actually, solve the rental crisis, etc. Why can't the Albanese government do the same here? And doing so would make sense politically, it makes sense socially, because obviously Australians don't want this, and it's not working anymore, and also work economically because we've just experienced a 10-year period of some of the worst productivity growth in the OECD. We've had a massive decline in living standards. We've got a generational rental crisis, or arguably the worst rental crisis in living memory.
Fair point.
And it could all be solved with, not all of it, but one of the solutions is to actually significantly cut immigration and make sure we've got a much smaller and better targeted system. And, if nothing else here, Trent, the one positive to come out of this and the rise of One Nation is that the Overton window on immigration, so the things that we're actually allowed to talk about and is acceptable politically, has now been opened, because now we've got all three sides of government, or the three major parties, the Coalition, now Labor and One Nation, all talking about lowering migration levels, which means we can talk about it without being accused of racism and xenophobia, and I think that's a good thing.
One very quick one for you without notice, Leith, before you go, and this happens every time you and I speak. I got a message here from Brian saying the Coalition does not know how to deliver their messaging. For example, how many people really know what $1 trillion debt represents? And I get this question in relation to what you say about immigration. You're articulating easy to understand numbers with data, same with debt and things like that. Is it fair to say that the Coalition has never had a better chance to articulate its position if it can work out how to do it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it also needs to actually come to a firm position, internally. So, unfortunately, we seem to get mixed messages from, Angus Taylor will say one thing and then you'll get a sort of contradiction from somewhere else. They need to come to a hard position, and it needs to be grounded in evidence. And actually, I think that's step one. That you have to come to a firm position within the party, and then all be on the same page and actually be able to articulate a consistent line. And we're just not seeing that. And as a result, we're all confused, because I honestly don't understand what the Coalition's migration policy is. And I follow this stuff.
Yes.
Exactly. Because it's all over the place, because you hear one thing and then you hear something else. They want to tie it to housing and then all this other thing. And I think that's the main problem. They need to come to a firm position and then stick to it.
Great to speak to you, mate. Thank you for your time as always.
Yeah, no worries, Trent. Anytime.
There he is. That's Leith Van Onselen, Treasury of Common Sense. You love it every week when he's on. Message